Yes, thank you. So I was going to give a bit of an overview, and it follows up a little bit on the first presentation, but I cannot really say it's a state of the art. It's a little bit more ecocentric because it's mostly presenting our own work, and I can't really promise that state of the art. But the idea was to give a little bit of an overview of how we think about what we call digital technologies in the whole value chain in Smart Forest, which is our center for research-based innovation, which is the main carrier for research in digital technologies in forestry in Norway at the moment. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on information flow rather than just forest operations and see how that can link to silviculture. And my first point is mainly that we have these different phases within the production chain, and I think one of the main points is that we have had very poor integration between the different processes. And one of the greater opportunities that we have is to get greater integration between those, and maybe that technology is one of those factors that actually creates that integration and merges the fields more than they were in the past. And I think that is one of the major opportunities that we have. So a good example is forest inventory, which has been traditionally very digital for a very long time. We have been using LiDAR-based inventories in the Nordics for many years operationally. But my point is, I think they have to a very little degree been used in silviculture. I don't think silvicultural technologies have actually been using all the digital information that we have in the inventories to a very large extent. So it's about getting that flow of information and understanding between the different processes. The other thing is that with technologies, fields such as inventory and harvesting are melting together because they to a very large extent use the same sensors. So we all of a sudden start collecting the same type of information in different steps of the production line, which we never did before. And that, of course, gives interesting opportunities for integration across the production line. So let's just start with what we can call inventory data collection. Of course, we have many different new sources of information, and of course, we have the traditional low-resolution area LiDAR, which we've been using for a long time. But I think one of the main interesting points is high-resolution point clouds, which now come at a relatively cheap cost and at scale. We've had TLS for a long time, but TLS was not practical. Gave great data, but anybody who's been collecting that in the field know that we do not cover very large areas. We now have sensors such as the books, where we can collect very large, very dense point clouds at a relatively low cost that actually give us information that we may be able to use and inform silviculture in a completely different way than we could before. I think we can argue that low-resolution ALS data was probably okay if we did very intensively managed even age plantations, but if we do more complex stands or less well-managed stands where we're interested in understory, suppressed trees, and so forth, it may not be so good. But I think that's where we see these very high resolution point clouds coming to play a very important role. But of course, we have to deal with them in an efficient way. And I still think that the very fundamental question that we have is what we could call instance and semantic segmentation. It's basically having an efficient way of identifying the individual tree, the instance, and the semantics, which means the needles, the branches, the stems, the ground, the rocks, whatever semantic classes we do. And one thing we're going to see, or what we already see, is that there's a wealth of algorithm coming out, right? Of all these things, there's so many algorithms that it's very, very, very hard for anybody to follow what is best. And I claim mine are best, and the other guy claims theirs is best, and the companies, they certainly claim theirs are best. Nobody really knows. And I think that's one of the things that we really need then when we see this explosion of data, is that we need these benchmarking data sets, because we really need to have common data sets to benchmark how good are the things we develop, because otherwise it becomes completely overwhelming and impossible to see what is the state of the art. So this is one example. It's going to be available for free download within the next week, I very much hope. It's a benchmark data set based on instance and segmentations. An example of what the data looks like here. It's different semantic classes and different instance classes, so it's going to be freely downloadable. And it has defined training data and defined testing data. So it actually can give benchmarks for how good are these algorithms. Of course, I think our framework to do this is best, but that's of course up to discussion. And basically, we have one framework that does this. It does instance segmentation based on .NET, and then it builds the trees from below with some algorithmic approach. Basically, creates a stem, create a graph through the tree, and so forth. I think what we should aim at now is to get a much more efficient way of dealing with these high-density point clouds, because there's a tendency now that when you capture this data, you have to spend 2 months analyzing it, and then you get some trees, but that's not very operational in some way. Right? It's almost more expensive to deal with the data than it is to collect it at the moment, and that's not going to work. So we have to get these pipelines that actually do this efficiently. And we have to say that when we look at this framework here, which use some deep learning approach for the semantic, and then use some algorithmic approach that builds graphs to the trees, the computational cost is in the algorithmic approach. It takes 90% of the time. The deep learning model and the semantic segmentations takes very little time. It's building these trees. So really, the aim should have to have this end-to-end pipeline for deep learning, for instance, and semantic segmentation. And I think we're going to see it not necessarily from the forestry side, but from some of the other people working with robotics or city mapping or God knows. And also, here is another benchmarking data set that's going to come. And I think that's another key aspect. This is from a collaboration across Europe in a cost action called 3D for Ecotech, nothing less. It's basically collected individual trees from across Europe, 20,000 individual point clouds across 33 tree species with more than 50 trees. And again, I think these types of data sets are really what going to promote our common, what we can say, state of the art for use of these data sets. And then, of course, how do we deal with them in an efficient way? And I think this aspect, actually, if we go back, I think this is quite illustrative, because of course we can deal with the trees as 3D objects as here. But in some way, a much more efficient way of looking at this is like 2D. Look at 2D images of the 3D objects. So this is what always, if you look in a textbook of tree species, right, this is how you see the tree beside the picture. You see the profile, and you can see what kind of tree it is. In some way, we can do exactly the same with 3D point clouds. We just take a 2D image. We look at the 2D image because the 2D analysis frameworks are very efficient and very fast. And it's actually how we see the world, so it's much more simple for a simple-minded person like me to understand. So this is one example from books data. You take the tree, you look at it from different sides. Here we detect whorls, so you can actually look at the different whorls within the individual tree. That, of course, gives a height trajectory growth rates from one laser scanning of that tree. Of course, this could also be implemented in a machine because it's so low computational. That is a very efficient thing that could be done live as well. Of course, this is a very nice data set. It may not work in reality, but it's proof of concept. But if we go to silviculture, then in some way, how do we use this information? And I think some years ago, we had the Precision project, which looked at root rot and using information to reduce or to do precision management around root rot. And I think it gives a good example of how we should think about using information. So the idea here was that we use the harvesters as data collectors. So they manually used the assortment that said whether or not you had rot in the trees. So then you get out a map of rot intensity. We use remote sensing data to say something about the productivity. And we use optimization to say what tree species should you plant where. If you have a lot of rot, you should most likely not plant spruce again. Of course, we knew that, but in effect, we of course knew all this. There's nothing new in that. We knew that, but nobody was doing it. Everybody was planting spruce. Not everybody, but a lot of people were planting spruce, no matter how much rot they had, because they never collected information about how much rot they had, and the information from the harvest was not transferred to the silviculture department, so they just planted spruce as they always did. That's a little bit simplified, but it happened a lot. It still happens a lot. And what we see is that, this kind of precision approach where we would actually try to plant different species would be quite profitable in a very, very large proportion of the stands that we have investigated. And we invested quite a lot of stands in this paper, or in this project. But of course, I think we should also try to see if we could actually follow the trees we plant a little bit more, and there's going to be a presentation about this a little bit later, about actually getting the locations of the trees we plant, and actually also follow a little bit the survival of the trees we plant, because in some way, we plant, but we're not very good at following up exactly what happens to those trees, if it's natural regeneration or it's actually the trees that we planted that survive, or whatever it is. We lack following up, but we can do that with the technology that we have today. And then if we go to the harvesting, I think again a little bit following up on the previous talk about precision forest, I think the information from the harvesters should really feed more back to the silvicultural decisions that we make to a much larger extent than it does today. Not just for optimizing bucking, but for optimizing silvicultural decisions. And of course, this comes back a little bit to what was mentioned with the positioning, and this is a small depth video from laser scanners on top of the harvesters, and running a real-time harvester head detection on that video. And that is exactly to do positioning of the machine, and it's to position the objects around the machine. So you can actually potentially see that you can now link, if you have this very good inventory with individual trees from high-resolution laser scanning, we think we can re-recognize them from the machine. And in some way, then we suddenly link what we can say the inventory of individual trees to the operation. And that's when it becomes interesting, because before, let's be realistic, we've done a lot of work on these individual tree inventories, but we never used them in operations. And they kind of just were there because it's cool, it looks nice, it gives wonderful presentations, and it's very interesting. But how much was it actually used when you did things in the forest? My point, I don't think very much. And I think that's what the opportunity is that we can do. And I will be done very soon. Thank you, done. And then, of course, I think also in some way we should try to link this to the properties of the trees. So this is just a very brief example of how we think about it, that we position trees from the harvester exact. Hopefully we even know what silviculture treatments have been around those. We mark the individual logs. We re-recognize them at the mill, and hopefully we can tie back the inner properties from the X-ray of those logs to the actual silviculture treatments and growing conditions these logs have had. And with that, I'll just say thank you.